welcome back to another chilling, thoughtful, and deeply curious edition of Darkwoods Paranormal. I'm your host, Gabriel Von Graves, coming to you from the edge where shadows meets reason, a place where the stories get a little deeper, the questions cut a little sharper, and the veil thins just enough for truth to breathe. Tonight, we invite you into a conversation that bridges psychology, ancient tradition, and the quiet mysteries of the human spirit. But before we bring up our guest, let me remind everyone watching follow Darkwoods Paranormal across all platforms: TikTok, YouTube, Facebook, and Instagrams. Join our community, send your stories, and stay connected to every investigation, every live stream, and every journey into the unknown. Visit us anytime at darkwoodsparanormal.com. And as always, tonight's broadcast is supported by our friends at Shaker's Cigar Bar in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, an iconic atmospheric institution and one of the very few cigar bars in the entire state where you can sit back, enjoy a handcrafted old fashioned, one of my favorites, and savor a rich cigar at the same time. And step into a building where it has its own history of hauntings. Whether you're craving that New Orleans energy or simply want a taste of Milwaukee's darker charm, Shakers welcomes you. Be sure to tell Bob that Darkwoods Paranormal sent you. Now, joining me, as she always does, is Raven Knight, investigator, researcher, and keeper of more eerie wisdom than she will ever admit. My friend, thank you for stepping once again into the dark woods with me, Raven. Welcome.
Thank
And
you.
tonight, we're honored to welcome a remarkable mind. Our guest is Dr. Euphoria Hotas, professor of psychology, doctoral chair, author, and certified healing arts practitioner for more than 3 decades. She has walked the thin line between science and spirit, weaving together psychology, ritual arts into a body of work that guides others forward, transformation, empowerment, and intuitive reconnection. Her works blends evidence-based psychology principles and ancient wisdom traditions. And it's this intersection, mind, myth, and the sacred arts, that makes her an extraordinary voice for tonight's discussion. Dividing her time between the United States and Greece, drawing upon Spartan heritage and exploring the deep psychological roots of healing, Dr. Hiotis brings a rare and powerful perspective to the paranormal. Welcome, you two. So settle in, dim the lights, and prepare yourself for an extraordinary of the psyche, the sacred and the unexplained. Raven Knight, Doctor, welcome to Darkwoods Paranormal. How you doing today, Doctor?
Thanks for having me.
Oh,
I'm doing good.
absolutely. It's good to have you.
We're super excited that you're here.
Yes, we
I
are.
know that we've talked a little bit, you and I have, and I'm just excited that you're finally on the show. I did count. Gabriel got your name right the
Got it
second
right the second time.
I only
time.
aim for 50%, so it's fine.
That's who you did good. You
That's a
did
good
good.
Yeah.
number.
Thank you very much.
He was practicing. He did good.
Thank you.
Um, so if you could actually just tell us a little bit about yourself, I wanna know, and I know Gabriel probably does too. How did you get started in the field? I know you do a little psychology. You also are an author. We will talk about your book in a little bit here as well. But
Fantastic.
how did you get your start?
I started very young, actually, when I was 18. In Chicago, in the inner city of Chicago, I worked in an after school program. And I was working with latchkey kids, or basically kids who didn't have a place to go home because their parents were working and they had nowhere to go at home. So I opened up an after school program. It had an arts, sports, and music center in the program. Like I said, I was 18, and the Albany Park Community Center, the place that was hosting it, also was having the endeavor of wanting something like that for the kids to go to a place after school so they could stay out of trouble, which reduced the gang activity that was happening over
Oh,
there.
fantastic.
And UNICEF was sponsoring this little program that I started up, and they would give us these pretty, I would say back then, this was back in the 90s, early 90s, they gave us some pretty generous checks so I could buy the art supplies, the music, and some of the sports equipment. So there were three kids, three of us. We were about 18, all the three of us. I was in charge of the art I was studying art therapy at the time. I was also going to school to study psychology, so I was, my major was in psychology by the time I was going into college, and my minor was in art, and I was also going for my art therapy certification. And so art was a big thing for me to work with the kids. They seemed to really catch on to the art, those that were drawn to the art. Some kids were drawn to the music, and some kids were drawn to sports. And some kids were drawn to all three. But the main goal of having this program was to keep the kids out of trouble. Because the neighborhoods back then were gang affiliated in a lot of gang activities. And then after that, I got my degree, I got my psychology degree, and continued to use my art therapy practice as a therapist. I went for a master's program at Northwestern University and pursued my master's degree with my certification in psychotherapy, and still used my art therapy practice, especially working with kids, because kids obviously have they're not as articulate when it comes to talking about things as they are expressing them through art. So that was a huge, really important tool to have in my tool belt at the time. So that's how I started out. I was pretty young at the age of 18 when I started in psychology. And then from there, it just continued. So 40 years later, here I am.
Well, welcome. Thank you very much for that. So you're an author. Can you tell us a little bit about your book?
Yes, I am the author of the Wild Mystics Guide series. It's more of a book collection than it is a series because they don't go in a particular order. What I focus on is a blend of ancient myth, and particularly Greek myth, because that's what I'm most familiar with. I'm not a mythologist, but I have been studying Greek myth, and especially ancient Greek myth, for years since high school. I'm considered what they would call a Jungian. Jung also used ancient Greek myth. He was a psychiatrist and a psychologist who was one of the forefathers of psychology. He used a lot of ancient Greek myth and mythological stories to chart out or navigate understandings of psychology. So I am Jungian at heart. I also blend ritual practices. Most of them are ancient healing practices such as drumming, chanting, dancing, or what I would say intuitive movement, and of course art and journaling. So there's pretty much 5 rituals that I use, or 5 modalities in those rituals, which were the ones that I just mentioned. And of course then the main one is psychology, and I blend those 3 things, ancient myth, ritual practices, and psychology, to help people explore the deeper layers of their consciousness and to also help them hone in on their intuition.
That's very interesting. Can you explain what that means, honing in their intuition?
Well, in psychology, we have something that's, we have 2 spaces. We have science, but there is an area that we allow to study spirit, and those 2 kind of intersect. In my line of work, I explore what happens at the edges of human experience. So the edges of a human experience means the places where psychology, myth, and the intuitive realm overlap, and where people have their most profound energetic encounters, which are really where the intuition lies. I mean, pretty much I've spent over 4 decades studying the mind, trauma, intuition, and altered states collectively. So it's a way of understanding how tuition channels through our psychological patterns, and how we understand intuition, which is a very, I would say, an inner map of ourselves, of understanding our inner world and our external world.
That's fascinating. So
that
go ahead, Raven.
you talk about intuition, and one of the things that people like to say is, trust your intuition, right? Trust your gut. How do you know whether it's your intuition that's actually talking to you, and how do you know how to trust that? How do you lean into that?
Good question, Raven.
Yeah, that is a good question. Intuition is something that lives not just in the mind or in the heart, it also lives in the body. And our ancient ancestors actually used intuition for everything that they did. It was an actual survival mechanism. So in our day and age, we would say that intuition is something that is an internal, intention. It's about tuning in and having an attention and awareness to a particular aspect of your life. But again, from an ancestral perspective, it's something that humans have always relied on. Our ancestors used intuition to sense danger, to sense spirits, to communicate with spirits, to sense energy and even changes in the environment, and even like weather patterns, right? So without science, we have still in us the intuitive aspects that have been inherited from our ancestors to be able to tune into those intuitive notions. And when people say that they feel a presence, or when they sense something, for example, when they're sensing something watching them, or when they say that they experience something that's deeply psychological and it relates to, let's say, your ancestral roots, when you have a deep feeling and strong feeling about something, but you don't know where it's coming from, that's really what intuition's about. And most people know whether it's intuition or not, because they will even say something like, wow, I don't know what this feeling's about. I don't know why I'm feeling this, but I'm feeling such and so. So they're feeling some kind of presence or energy, and that's where their intuition is speaking to them, so to speak. It's just a matter of knowing to trust yourself. And if you can trust yourself with that voice that's coming in from inside, where you're feeling that unseen presence, or when you're sensing something that's watching you, or someone that's watching you, that's intuition. That's your intuition trying to speak to you.
So with your psychological happier brain, how do you coincide that with intuition?
Well, that's where your moments, your awareness shifts
Mm-hmm.
and your senses heighten. That's really where the crux of intuition is. Your senses heighten and you're more open to the unseen. And, this can happen not just in places, but obviously in more places where there's nature. It could happen during moments of grief where you're overcome with a sense of grief. And even trauma recovery, that's where intuition usually lies, in those aspects where you're going through something that's very intense. So it's anytime you're between one reality and another, or when you're shifting from one transition to another, we rely on our intuition more than our logic to make that change, or to make that change from, let's say, you're going through a loss and you're trying to overcome that loss and going through a moment of grieving. I've seen that happen also with people who are overcoming substance use, where they're going into a program and they're having a therapist who helps them with the substance abuse or the substance use and going into recovery. But it's really that liminal area, that in between area, where they're using their intuition and relying on their intuition to get from one stage to the next.
Okay. So intuition. So to me, I do also rely on my intuition. To me, it's a little voice, kind of in the back of my head, telling me what to do. Would you say that's intuition, or how else would you describe it?
I would say it's also a gut feeling. So remember, our ancestors portrayed intuition as a form of divine or ancestral communication, right? All of our ancient ancestors used intuition, and they didn't separate a gut feeling from, for example, spiritual guidance, which is what they really relied on. All of our ancient ancestors had some strong intuition, and they also relied on their instinct, which is very similar. It's a pull or a warning or some sudden insight that was understood back then as a language, right? Or a message. And we still have those. We still rely on those because those have been inherited from our ancestors. They can be from a form of a message, a form of a god or a deity, an ancestor, even a demon, and even like from your own deeper self or your own deeper voice. So, for example, we had, there's so many stories, like even in Greek mythology and other parts of the world, we had heroes that constantly relied on their intuition, right? For example, Odysseus, the Greek hero, he survived because he trusted internal nudges and subtle signs and warning signs of danger. We even had priestesses, an oracle of Delphi, for example, who used intuition to amplify through ritual, right? So it's not just a feeling, it's also getting in touch with intuition through doing rituals. So not just by feeling, but doing and doing the actions to get in touch with your intuition. We had gods and goddesses who embodied intuition by representing just the simple parts of knowing about something when our logic fails. So intuition wasn't really irrational, it's the opposite. It was a respected form of perception, and we still have that. Our perception is really about things that we get hints or glimpses from, like a gut feeling, dreams, rituals, moments of danger when we feel like we're in moments of danger, even if there's something not around us that signals that.
Fight or flight.
Yeah, it's a fight or flight. I mean, it's also think about intuition as being a bridge between human consciousness and the unseen world. It helps us understand or at least be aware of the difference between human consciousness and the unseen world. And that's where it's interesting because that's exactly how people still experience it today. I mean, these things that we've talked about in myth and ancient ancestral heritage, and we're still having these experiences. It hasn't changed for us.
Well, without generalizing, do you think modern man or person have lost that instinct, our intuition?
I think many of us have lost that intuition. I think we've lost a lot of what humanity's first language was, which was understanding things that were unseen. For example, we understood and we lived myth. For example, myth wasn't just stories telling, it was a way to explain patterns of the human experience, right? And I think we've lost touch with those aspects of humanity. Humanity's first language was myth and paranormal. Ancient people used gods, spirits, and the underworld stories to explain some of the strange, intuitive, and supernatural experiences that we still have today. Unfortunately, I feel that I'm seeing that we've moved away from that. And myth and paranormal are two sides of the same coin because both describe what happens when humans encounter things that are unexplainable, are misunderstood, or unseen. And I think that's where the piece is that we've lost our language. We've lost our ancient language.
What do you think? A better question would be, how do you think modern men have lost that ability?
I love it
Well,
when
I
you read
think
my
it's
mind.
important. It's also important to think about what happened, not just but also when, which was, long ago, long before we had psychology or science. Myth, which explained the paranormal and paranormal explained myth, was our original language for describing supernatural experiences or encounters like spirits, strange presence, prophetic dreams, visitations, ancestral visitations, shadows, omens, energies, and all the things that we still experience today. However, there are people who are, not realizing, there's many people that don't realize that we still share those ancestral experiences. These are things that have been passed on to us in our genes, and they're being expressed today. For example, when someone in the ancient world felt watched in the dark or sensed a presence, for example, in a cave, or had a dream that they felt was very real, they didn't call it intuition or paranormal activity. They just simply explained it through gods, through spirits, ancestors, nymphs, demons. Myth wasn't fiction, and neither was paranormal. It was a framework for the unexplainable. It was a way to provide phenomena that were and still are unexplained. So when we
So,
talk about, for example, something like a shadow figure,
mhm.
what's fascinating is the patterns are the same as they were back then. They're the same today. People today describe the same sensations. The same intuitive hits, the same presences, just with a different language. And myth and the paranormal, which, like I said, are the both two sides of the same coin, they serve as a symbolic map for experiences that still happen.
So would you say that the reason why modern man has lost it is because it's no longer taught to us as children?
I think it's also not only taught to us as children, but also we've relied so much on the rational parts of science. And, there's more people out there, and I'm not saying that we shouldn't use science. Science is very important for us to understand many phenomenon that are occurring around the world. But I also think it's just as important for us to understand that there are things that are unseen, and that we also need to rely on other frameworks for those unexplainable phenomenon. Many people I've learned over the years have talked to me about stories about having a protective ancestor, or they hear a particular whisper in their dream that gives them a message, or they get a certain feeling of being guided. So these are very strong intuitive experiences that we can't deny. Science cannot explain everything, and those are the kinds of things that we still can't explain. And they sit on the same fault line in terms of all these experiences where the human consciousness meets something much larger, older, and harder to name, where these paranormal experiences simply, reflect on the ancient records of what our ancestors lived through.
So in
So,
Greek mythology, what is paranormal?
Paranormal in Greek mythology is myth. And it's in every culture, not just Greek mythology, but in particular, every culture encoded supernatural encounters. They use Greek, like Greek myth. They've used gods. They've described encounters with gods and goddesses, spirits, monsters, omens, because that was the only language that they had for the strange, the unexplainable. Myth is the memory of humanity's oldest experiences. And so, for example, in Greek myth, it was a way for the Greeks to explain intuition that wasn't very rational. It was a respected form of perception. And especially in those moments where we were talking about before, those liminal spaces where we make transitions, where we make very crucial transitions between one life phase and another. It was also a place where Greek myth spoke in dreams, in rituals, and of course in dangerous places. And the ancient Greeks believed in their myths that, it was described in their myths that intuition was that bridge between the human experience and the unseen world, the rational side and the unrational side, the perceptible side, the observable side, and the unobservable side. And like I said, we're still living it today. It's the difference is that we just called it myth back then, which was more of something like I said, a human experience pattern. And that's the part where we're still seeing those patterns today. And it's still, the supernatural wasn't separate from everyday life. It was woven into the landscape. Spirits weren't seen as abstract ideas. They were actually part of nature. They were part of the land. They were inherited in the land. And they were part of our ancestors. We recognize as ancestors that spirits lived among us.
it's kind of crazy to think that we went from having this be a major part of who we were, and now it's like if you see, and we've learned with it's gotten a little bit more popular in the last couple of years with ghost hunters. Like ghost hunters came out, and all of a sudden it was like, oh, now it's okay to talk about these things. But for a long time, it was such a stigma. There was such a stereotype about seeing things or having things happen to you. So that is very interesting. That
Well, I mean, yeah, exactly. And to your point, hauntings in ancient, in Greek myth, they weren't usually about malevolent ghosts. I mean, we assume that hauntings today are like you said, there's something, there's a stigma associated with it. Not necessarily. In Greek myth, hauntings were more related to spirits. There was a term that's called psyche or psyche. It's basically means the soul, and and in particular, they believed in the soul of the dead that lingered when something was unresolved, or when they wanted to warn someone or guide someone through a difficult period in their life. Hauntings weren't something to be feared. They weren't fear-based stories. They were meant to be relational. They were meant to have humans understand certain aspects of themselves, and to understand and navigate very difficult parts of their periods in their life. The dead weren't seen as something that were just buried and remembered. The dead were part of the community. They were part of the living, and they were essential to the community because they also symbolized a wisdom that we could never access in the living world. And it's many people still believe that, and they really do tap into that with their intuition. Like I said, I've had many people who talk about their hauntings, or a spirit that has visited them, that is trying to communicate something in particular, or warn them, or guide them through a particular difficult period in their life.
Raven, did you have?
It was good.
Well,
Yeah.
another example, and I just wanted to circle back on that.
Yeah.
We're talking about intuition and hauntings and all that. Another really important aspect of ancient Greek myth, and many myths around, and many cultures, we had something that were called oracles. Oracles were deeply connected to what we're talking about in terms of intuition, and just listening to their gut feeling, and also being able to accept things that are unexplainable, because they're basically discussing things or talking about things from from a layered reality, a very deep layer, a different layer of reality. And people didn't go to oracles just to predict the future. They went there to access that different layer of reality, that deeper sense of intuition. We see that a lot today when people go to see a priest, right? Or to go to a counselor or a therapist or a psychic even. We're really not going there just to get a prediction of the future. When we go to seek these types of experiences, we're really ultimately what we're trying to do is get deeper access to our intuition, and to listen to that inner voice for guidance.
How does one reconnect with their intuition in modern day?
You did it
There's
again.
many ways you can do that. In my books, I actually offer those 5 modalities that I was talking about, and those 5 modalities are very important because they're the crux of the healing arts, so to speak. There are many ways you can practice, creating more heightened intuition. But I offer guided practices in my books, and each book does offer those 5 modalities that we were talking about, which are drumming, chanting or singing, intuitive movement and dance, and art and journaling and writing. Those aspects are some things that we've done for a very long time, right? Our ancestors were actually more deeply attuned to those types of rituals, and they did it religiously, right? They were meant to be done. Shamans were drumming and singing and chanting, and the community was doing it with the shamans who would lead the community through their intuitive wisdom. Art has always been surrounding humanity in caves, right? So all of these artistic healing rituals and modalities can really help you hone in on your intuition, especially when you're focused on a particular aspect of something that you're encountering in life. My books offer those rituals at the end of each chapter. So I have a theme in each chapter, and after each chapter I offer a particular modality of those five that I was just talking about that align with that theme. They're not meant, those rituals aren't meant for me to solve a problem or to give you any type of predictions of the future or anything of that sort. They're meant to help you hone in on entering an altered state so that you can shift your consciousness and help understand intuition that becomes sharper for you. It's a way of helping you communicate with yourself so that you can really hone in on that intuitive part of yourself.
So how did you go from, you were like you said at the beginning, you know, you're helping kids, and how did you go from that to really getting into the study of everything that you're talking about now? How did that transition? And then I guess this is a little bit of a two-parter. Have you had any of your own paranormal experiences that have maybe led you down this path?
Well, I mean, I grew up paying attention to and being exposed to ancient Greek stories about spirits, thresholds, shadows, oracles, the underworld. So later, when I was studying psychology, because a lot of the original psychologist authors, meaning Freud and Carl Jung, we talked about that. They used myth and definitely, definitely Greek mythology in their work. So when I was paying attention to the way that they were describing some things like archetypal psychology, which is another bridge or another branch of psychology, I really started to make the connection between what I saw in terms of the things that we can't explain, the thresholds outside of the edges of the human experience. And so I started to dedicate my life's work naturally, bridging those two worlds, the science and spirit. And I became increasingly interested in helping people understand their intuitive awakenings and their personal encounters, because one thing I kept hearing when I was a therapist before I went into more of the teaching side, as being a professor of psychology now, is I kept hearing people talk about their personal encounters. And every time I would hear someone's story, I always heard that strong blend of psychology and myth. And what was fascinating is how the mind responds to those moments that people are dealing with, especially if they're dealing with something difficult or when they're going through an adverse experience like grief or overcoming grief or recovering from a trauma. It's fascinating how the mind responds to those moments because intuition sharpens. I've noticed that people's intuition sharpens and people start sensing things they normally wouldn't. And what's even more fascinating is that these experiences aren't new. Like we said, our ancestors understood them deeply and they knew exactly what these encounters meant. One thing I've learned over the years is that the paranormal experiences have psychological patterns. So when I was listening to people's narratives of their stories, I also found that there were psychological patterns and certain states of mind that people would be describing would make them more open to the unseen. And there's a reason that some people sense things that others don't, by the way, and it's because that sensitivity that they developed, it's deeply tied to their intuition and trauma, which was one thing that I was listening to, and just basically the structure of their psyche. When I started to listen to these stories, I started to realize that the brain and the spirit respond to experiences. It's not just that we're taking in certain moments and putting them in our minds and storing them. That led me to start looking into the effects of trauma and how trauma or even experiences that are very sensitive, right? Any personally sensitive experiences or even challenging experiences had a lot to do with what people were sensing. So for example, I've learned that people who experience the paranormal often share something in common. They've had extremely heightened emotional or ancestral sensitivity. And I started to learn that trauma creates openings in the psyche. It sometimes that's when the paranormal steps through those openings. So when someone says something like they see or feel something unusual, my first question is, okay, what threshold are you crossing, or what major line are you crossing in your life right now? Are you transitioning from a loss and now you're going into grief recovery? Are you transitioning from substance use to to recovery? There's usually a very important part in their life where their senses are becoming more heightened and they're paying attention and aware, and that's when that's where the shift happens. And so that's how I wound up being where I am today, where I'm really paying attention to people's stories and likening their stories to ancient myth and connecting to ritual, because those rituals are something that we've been doing, like I said, for since humanity. It's a very old language.
So that leads me to there is the, I don't even know, there's the saying, or I don't even want to say the saying, but how people who have experienced trauma or certain levels of abuse are also more empathetic because they know how to watch for cues because they've learned it, right? That's something that I've heard or read before. We also have this theory that a lot of our people that we've associated with in the paranormal community who have had lots of interesting experiences in the paranormal also have had near-death experiences. Is this something that you, because when you're talking about this, I'm like, this kind of is making a lot of sense in certain ways. So I guess could you maybe elaborate or touch on some of that?
So there's something about trauma or overcoming very difficult periods in our life that really do open us. I wouldn't say susceptible, because that's not necessarily the word I would use. I would say more open. One thing I'm very careful about when talking about trauma is to honor how real and difficult it is, but I also acknowledge the other side of it. In psychology, we talk about something that's called post-traumatic growth. Post-traumatic growth means that after a painful or overwhelming experience, some people develop sharper intuition and what you described before, which is deeper empathy. They develop a deeper sense of empathy towards others, especially, and they also have, they also explain or describe a stronger connection to their inner world, which is that intuition that we were talking about. Trauma, it's interesting because trauma can heighten awareness because the mind becomes more alert. Remember, trauma lives in the mind, but it also lives in the body, right? Because when we experience things, we don't just experience it in the mind, it also is ingrained in the body. And so when we experience something and we're overcoming, for example, a traumatic experience, not only is our mind more alert, but our body is also more alert. Our mind and our body become more perceptive, right? And we are more attuned to even the most subtlest cues. Our senses become more alert. So in spiritual language, that's often described as the veil thinning, right? It also can be described as intuition waking up or an awakening. I don't romanticize trauma by any means, but I do recognize that many people come out of it with abilities or sensitivities that weren't as accessible before. Our ancestors saw this as a kind of an initiation, albeit a difficult one, but one that often opened a person to deeper wisdom. But in the paranormal world, we can say that people often assume that this sensitivity comes from something mystical happening. But really, for a lot of people, it really begins with our survival mechanisms, right? Because those are deeply instilled in us, and again, that also lives within the mind and the body. And this is something that has been ingrained in us and inherited from our ancient ancestors. And when you've lived through something overwhelming, your mind learns to scan the environment differently, and you pick up on energy, tone, voice, and even silence. And we pick up on certain shifts in the atmosphere, for example, right?
Absolutely.
That other people overlook.
Hmm.
And we also see that people don't just bounce back. You know, I've observed that people don't just bounce back from the trauma. They sometimes gain new strengths, and that's where the post-traumatic growth really, that's where it really lies. You know, they gain particular strengths that make more meaning from experiences. You know, the heightened sense of intuition that we talked about, the empathy, and spiritual awareness. So when someone has lived through trauma, that tells me that they sense something others don't, you know, because, you know, I'm not surprised when they tell me that. When most people who tell me I've gone through something traumatic and I'm currently recovering from it or have recovered from something, they're also telling me that they also have they have a tendency to see or feel things that other people don't. That's not surprising. The psyche remembers, the soul remembers, the body and the mind remember. And sometimes that remembering opens up the door to the intuitive or even the supernatural.
Would you, how would you explain interracial beings, aliens, and the paranormal? Are they the same um, substance, or do you think of them differently?
Well, I can't really speak for extraterrestrial beings because I've never encountered one. um, but I would say that they fall, you know, intuitively they fall into the paranormal, the broader umbrella of the paranormal, because they are, uh, there's not, and I'm not saying they don't exist, I'm saying that there's not enough evidence to provide proof for their existence. Not saying that, again, I'm not saying that they do not exist. It's just that we don't have hard evidence to prove their existence. And we don't have hard evidence to prove the existence of ghosts, right? So that doesn't mean they don't exist. It just means we don't have the hard evidence like we would with DNA, for example. Science has hard evidence, empirical evidence to prove certain phenomenon, whereas we don't have hard evidence to prove others. So to me, paranormal, the broader umbrella of the paranormal, extraterrestrials falls under that category. It's one phenomenon under the paranormal,
Is there
but
Greek
not.
mythology on visitors from outer space?
Yes, Greek mythology does have stories of visitors from outer space, but mainly they explain those through the gods and the goddesses, right? And they also use concepts that are called demons, not demons the way that we see them today, not demons that jump out of, you know, biblical stories, but
Hmm.
demons meaning they were forces of energy or unseen figures that kind of had trickster-like qualities to them, and they didn't really outwardly say that they were aliens, but they were definitely unearthly beings. You could put it that way. So yes, they did. You know, they did explain a lot of their mythology through gods and goddesses who were not, you know, living on Earth. So I guess you could say they were extraterrestrial beings, spirits, nymphs, which were earthy but not of the earth, and demons. So I guess you can say they were a conglomerate of, you know, I guess you could say extraterrestrial, but not aliens in the sense that we see them today.
You want me?
Okay. What?
All right. So, well, at on Darkwood's Paranormal, we talk a lot about the thinning the veil, which you touched on. We talk about a lot about the paranormal. Raven Knight and I both have been in places that we can definitely say, even though we have no evidence, but you can feel that there's something else there. And it's not always demons are demonic or even evil. You know, a lot of it is just a different presence. Um, so, what is your favorite Greek mythology that you can tell us about the Greek legends that you find most relatable?
I really enjoy mythology. I'm not a mythologist,
I
but
understand.
I have been studying it for years, and study it from a psychological perspective.
Hmm.
I look at the parallels between how we live our human experiences and how they relate to mythology, which they're very parallel. One of my favorite myths is the myth of Medusa, the story of
Ah,
Medusa.
yes.
Medusa was originally a beautiful priestess who was studying to be under Athena's temple. And she went through a violating experience that was quite traumatic for her. There's several variations of the myth depending on, the period of time that it was, the myth was, or the story was told, because the myths evolve over time. But tragically for Medusa, Medusa was violated by Poseidon, and it's such a tragic, life altering experience for her that she was punished. Athena punished her, and she was transformed from a beautiful maiden who was a priestess in the making to a hideously monstrous being that had snakes in her hair, as her hair, and she had a gaze that was very dangerous to the point where she would turn you to stone. Now, my interpretation of that myth goes in several directions, but the main point of the story is that she was not only violated, but she was also vilified for having her experience and had no support whatsoever from anybody around her, because now she's ostracized and turned into a monster. And she's forced to live in a cave, and in that cave, she turns eventually Perseus into stone. One thing that's really important about Medusa's story is that she had, of course, snakes of hair, which we talked about, but when Perseus eventually decapitated her, which is part of the myth, and you can read a little bit more about it in my book, her blood, they found, was very potent. And one side of her blood, coming from the one side of her head, was very healing. It was so powerful, it was magic. The other side of her head that sprung the other blood was poison. And her blood then became very sought after. It was considered a very powerful magic, depending on how you wanted to use it. And so that's the very, very important piece, which is that when we go through hardships or we go through things that are very like dark periods in our life, we have the choice of using our resources to either the better or for worse. Another interesting part about Medusa's story is that after she was decapitated and the blood sprang forth from her head, Pegasus, one of the most majestic creatures, the winged horse,
Hmm.
sprang from the blood. He was
Oh,
basically birthed from the blood. Talk about paranormal, right? Talk about a
right.
paranormal story. But we see in those paranormal moments, the explanations of the paranormal, that Pegasus would go on to spring to the heavens, and he ultimately was a source of light. So out of the darkness came the light, right? Out of Medusa's trauma, blood, decapitation, some ugly things came something so beautiful, with this beautiful, majestic horse who was actually residing under the realm of the inspiration and the arts. He was a guide for the muses, the nine muses, and really inspired poetry, art, music, and all the beautiful things that humanity can create. So I love that story because we see such a dark side of Medusa, but we also see that Medusa was capable of producing from the darkness. She was capable of producing so much beauty through her terrible ordeal.
Hmm.
And she had those two sides, and basically, the way that I see it is humanity. As humanity, we have, as humans, we have two choices, that we can go the dark side or we can go the light side, and it depends on what we interpret and what we want, and how we interpret our experiences.
That's fascinating. I love that story. Thank you very much. So, we also talk a lot about cryptozoology. In Raven and I, we both differ from our beliefs. So, talk to us a
I
little bit
was
about
waiting for it. I was
cryptozoology.
waiting. And I've been
talk,
waiting.
talk a
I've
little
been
bit about
waiting.
cryptozoology.
Okay, so I could go on with cryptozoology. In mythology, there's
Right.
just so many,
Would you
so many.
refer to them as gods as well? Certain different
I would say
aspects?
that some of them were demigods.
Okay.
I could also say at this point that would you add Bigfoot to that category?
The non-real Bigfoot? Yes, I would.
All right. So Gabriel does not believe. I definitely believe and I'm gonna have to explain it for the rest of the people listening. Every episode we do this. Every episode, it's like, hey, let's try to convince Gabriel that Bigfoot's real. You can go ahead with your own speculations and what you think over there, but you don't have to convince him.
Well,
If you're on the other end, if you're with him, you
before
can
you
tell
do, Doctor, I want to segue in saying this. So, when something becomes very commercialized, I think it no longer is a real thing, right? I mean, they commercialize it to the point that there is just it's an industry unto itself. But please, talk to me a little bit about Bigfoot. Convince me.
Okay, well, I'm going to say this. I'm going to say that the paranormal and including Bigfoot as a phenomenon it's not just what we see, right?
Right,
We talked about this before. It's also about what we sense, what
right,
we
absolutely,
remember, and what we
absolutely,
feel in our bones, right? We
right.
feel something deep in our bones, and the unseen is not always dangerous either. It could be profoundly transformative. I'm going to say that I'm just going to put this out there and leave it where it is when I
Yeah,
tell you this story.
yes,
So
please.
we visited the Bigfoot Museum in Blue Ridge, Georgia, which, by the way, Blue Ridge is a beautiful area that's in the foothills of the Appalachians, and there's just vast miles and miles of beautiful woods, wild woods. And, we do a lot of hiking. My husband and I do a lot of hiking. I've never seen Bigfoot. I can't say that I would ever expect to see Bigfoot. I don't even know if I've even seen anything that resembles Bigfoot. However, I will tell you this. When we visited, we went to the Bigfoot Museum in Blue Ridge. There was some surprisingly compelling evidence.
Like what?
I have never sensed it, I have never felt it, I've never seen it in terms of the Bigfoot or evidence, but I sure did see a lot of things at the museum, such as a lot of archives, a lot of stories, mapped dots where people have seen Bigfoot all over the United States, recordings. They have footprints that did not seem like they were. I do put my skeptic hat on occasionally, right? I am a scientist at heart, but I'm also, into accepting, having an open mind. So I did kind of see footprints that did not look doctored. I will say that. I can say that I walked out of the museum. By the time I went in, I was definitely a skeptic, or should I say a naysayer. By the time I walked out of that museum, after I saw, heard, you know, felt things, read things, was exposed to all sorts of evidence in different forms, I couldn't say when I walked out I was a skeptic. I
Well,
wouldn't say that I would believe that there's a bit of foot, but I was definitely a little bit more towards accepting a slight possibility.
well, most cultures have a myth or a legend of such a creature. Since you're a resident expert on the Greek mythology, as it were, what in Greek mythology, what legend would represent something like a Bigfoot?
I'm going to venture out and actually say that one of, a very well-known forest creature that has a different nature to it than Bigfoot. We had, we had centaurs, we had satyrs, and we
Hmm.
had a god that's called Pan, Pan.
Okay.
Pan was half man, half god.
Okay.
And the reason why I would liken Pan to Bigfoot is because he lived in the woods. He was, his domain was wilderness, and he was very feared and revered at the same time. And his sightings and reports were very important. People actually took the possibility that he lived in the woods and the possibility that they would run into Pan when they were either hunting or just, walking in the woods, was very significant because Pan not only, was living in the realm, and his domain wasn't just about the wilderness. He also had a very masculine force to him. He was known to really engage with the people that he encountered in the woods in terms of mythical stories. And he carried around a pan flute and played music. And during those times that he would play music in ritual, he would be having rituals with a god called Dionysius. Dionysius is also in the Roman version later, maybe more well known as Bacchus. And if you've heard of the Bacchus rites, where they're drinking wine and having orgies and dancing naked under the moon, all those images that we've described, they originate from Pan, because Pan partied basically with Dionysius, the god of revelry and I guess you can say revelry and debauchery. So when someone encountered Pan, they were overcome by his trickster-like qualities. And like I said, he was, people looked for him. People looked for Pan. People looked for that creature and
So it,
expected him
it
to
was a
be
gift. If you ran across this
a
creature,
gift,
it was
or
actually a
people
gift.
were gift or mortified, because what
Sure.
followed with Pan was something that's called pandemonium.
Oh, okay.
And pandemonium comes from the word pan.
Okay.
And it has a lot to do with chaos, chaos,
Mhm.
ensuing chaos, and just, fear, but then also revelry and things that we can't control because they would occur in the wilderness. And so I
Oh,
liken Pan to Bigfoot, not in resemblance, but in the stories of how Bigfoot also is known to be living in the wilderness. And if you do encounter him, most people are excited about it, but also very fearful, because this is a massive, right? It's a massive
of
creature
course. Of
that
course.
makes us feel very out of control. And that's what Pan did, because Pan was, like I said, he was also a trickster. He liked to create chaos, and he did it through, you know, a lot of revelry, a lot of anarchy, a lot of, I guess you can say, uncontrollable rituals with Dionysius. And so that's how I liken Pan with Bigfoot. And in fact, sometimes I kind of muse myself when I'm walking in the woods, or if I'm hiking in the woods, I muse myself because I look out into the woods and say, gosh, what is out there? You hear some noises that are not familiar, and it's some kind of animal or some creature, and you can't help but ask yourself, what is that? What is that I'm hearing? But you can't see it. So I immediately, my brain switches to Pan, or something that's the unknown. To me,
Mhm.
Bigfoot and Pan they symbolize that unknown in the wilderness and what's going to happen when you encounter that creature.
Fascinating. Fascinating. Raven, do you have any other questions?
I was gonna say, I mean, this has all been super interesting. And you're bringing me back to, now I'm like, I think I took a class on Greek mythology in college. It was like 20 years ago, but now I'm like, oh wait, I know this story and I know that. So thank you for that. That was very nostalgic. I've never like even would have thought of putting like Greek mythology and the paranormal together into one thing like this. So this has been a very interesting hour for me.
You've been very informative. Absolutely.
Yes, for sure. I would love to ask you, I mean, we normally ask our guests anyway, but like, how can people find you and follow you and find your books? Because I mean, I'm not, and I say this every time, but I'm not a reader, but I am really, really interested in becoming one. So how do we find you, for those out there that are interested in this as well?
So all
Pleasure.
my books, I have 3 books right now out on Amazon. I have the Wild Mystic's Guide to Medusa.
There she is, Medusa.
I also have the Wild Mystic's Guide to Hecate, who is the goddess of witchcraft. I wouldn't say witchcraft because I don't really follow that. It's more about liminal states and transition. So I should say that. She also resides over the moon and changes. My books are more spiritual than witchcraft, so I want to emphasize that because I don't have a revisionist version. So if people are looking for witchcraft books, my books are more about psychospiritual aspects coming from psychology. But this is the other one. And I also have one called The Wild Mystic's Guide to the Witch. That is also a psychospiritual book. Not really related to witchcraft because I don't practice that. Not that I have anything against it. I just don't. That's not where my specialty is. So those 3 are available on Amazon. I have more books coming out I'm working on this year. You can reach me via email at drheotis@wildmysticsguide.com. I'm also on Facebook and on Instagram. You can find me by my name, Euphoria Heotis. And my final thought I'd like to share is that, the bottom line is that intuition is an inner compass. And the more you trust it, the clearer your path becomes.
I love it. You've been absolutely fascinating. I hope we can have you on again and we can go into deeper subjects. You have such a vast knowledge. An hour just wouldn't cover it. Thank you so much for your time.
Thanks for having me.
Well, as the shadows settle and the curtain draws closed, we want to extend our deepest gratitude to the good doctor for sharing her insight, her wisdom, and her remarkable perspective on the nature in the mind, the sacred and the unseen forces that shape our lives. Her work reminds us that every mystery has layers and every truth carries a heartbeat. To my partner in crime, Raven Knight, thank you very much, as always, for bringing your intuition, your knowledge, and your steady presence to these journeys. We walk these paths together. Also, I want to thank our sponsor as well, Hudson Smokehouse in Ironton, Minnesota. Thank you very much for allowing us to enjoy your foods. And to all of you watching, thank you for joining us tonight at Darkwoods Paranormal. Remember to follow us across of all our media platforms. You can find us everywhere. Thank you very much for staying with us. And as always, stay curious, stay aware, and above all, do stay safe out there.
Do stay safe out there. Thank you, everybody.
you.
And stay on for a few minutes afterwards, please, Euphoria. So